Datu is the title for chiefs, sovereign princes, and monarchs in the Visayas and Mindanao regions of the Philippines. Together with Lakan, Apu in central and northern Luzon, Sultan and Raja, they are titles used for native royalty, and are still currently used especially in Mindanao and Sula. Depending upon the prestige of the sovereign prince, this title of Datu could be roughly equated to the European dukes, marquesses, counts, or barons. In big barangays, which had contacts with other Southeast Asian cultures through trade, some datus took the title Raja or Sultan. The word Datu is akin to the Malay word Dato or Datuk, which are royal titles of the Malay people, and to the Fijian title of Ratu. Proofs of Filipino royalty and nobility must be demonstrated only by blood descent, that is, one has to have native blood in his veins, and must be a descendant of ancient native royal or noble families. History: Datu in Moro and Lumad societies in Mindanao. The Spaniards took possession of most of Luzon and the Visayas, converting the lowland population to Christianity. But although Spain eventually established footholds in northern and eastern Mindanao and the Zamboanga Peninsula, its armies failed to colonize the rest of Mindanao. This area was populated by Islamized peoples and by many non-Muslim indigenous groups, now known as Lumads. The Moro societies of Mindanao and Sula. In the traditional structure of Moro societies, the sultans were the highest authority, followed by the datus or raja, with their rule being sanctioned by the Quran. Datus were supported by their tribes. In return for tribute and labor, the Datu provided aid in emergencies and advocacy in disputes with other communities and warfare through the Agama and Maratabat laws. During the Spanish colonization of the archipelago, the datus of Moro principalities in Mindanao and Sula gave a very strong and effective resistance to the Catholicism of that southern island, and were able to successfully defend their identity and Islamic faith for over 300 years. However, what other people say, they have never surrendered their sovereignty to the United States of America in the much debatable Bates Treaty. After some years after the fall of the Spanish dominion in the Philippine Islands, they view that they were illegally annexed as part of the Republic upon the country's independence in 1946 without their consent and representation. The Lumad societies of Mindanao. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Lumads controlled an area that now covers 17 of Mindanao unregistered trademark S24 provinces but by the 1980 census they constituted less than 6% of the population of Mindanao and Sula. Heavy migration to Mindanao of Visayans, spurred by government-sponsored resettlement programs, turned the Lumads into minorities. The Bukidnon province population grew from 63,470 in 1948 to 194,368 in 1960 and 762 in 1970, with the proportion of indigenous Bukidnons falling from 64% to 33% to 14%. There are 18 Lumad ethno-linguistic groups: Ata, Bagobo, Banin, Bar unregistered trademark Lan, Bukidnon, Dibabulan, Higanan, Mamanwa, Mandaya, Manguingan, Manobo, Mansaka, Spanan, Tagakaulo, Tasade, Ta unregistered trademark Balai, Tajuri, and Yubo. The Lumad datus, on their part, have involved themselves in protecting their homeland forests from illegal loggers during the past decades. Some have joined the New People's Army, a communist rebel group in the country, for the cause of their people. Others have resisted joining the Moro and communist separatist movements. A Datu is still basic to the smooth functioning of the Lumad and Moro societies today. They have continued to act as the community leaders in their respective tribes among a variety of indigenous peoples in Mindanao. The Moro, the Lumads and the Visayans now share with new settlers a homeland in Mindanao. Datu in pre-colonial principalities in the Visayas. In more affluent and powerful territorial jurisdictions and principalities in Visayas, for example, Lanao, Cebu and Leyte, the Datu class was at the top of a divinely sanctioned and stable social order in a sakop or kinadatuan, which is elsewhere commonly referred to also as barangay. This social order was divided into three classes. The Kadatuan were compared by the Boxer Codex to the titled lords in Spain. As a galan or ramu, the datus enjoyed an ascribed right to respect, obedience, and support from their Oripun, or followers belonging to the third order. These datus had acquired rights to the same advantages from their legal timuwa, or vassals, who bind themselves to the Datu as his seafaring warriors. Timuwas paid no tribute, and rendered no agricultural labor. They had a portion of the Datu's blood in their veins. The above-mentioned Boxer Codex calls these Timuwas knights and hidalgos. The Spanish conquistador, Miguel de Lorca, described them as free men, neither chiefs nor slaves. In the late 1600s, the Spanish Jesuit priest Fr. Francisco Ignacio Alcina, classified them as the third rank of nobility. To maintain purity of bloodline, datus marry only among their kind, often seeking high-ranking brides in other barangays, abducting them, or contracting brideprices in gold, slaves and jewelry. Meanwhile, the datus keep their marriageable daughters secluded for protection and prestige. These well-guarded and protected high-born women were called binakot, the datus of pure descent were called potlingar datu, or lubasangar datu, while a woman of noble lineage are addressed by the pintados as Yuri, for example, Yuri Hilwe. Datu in pre-colonial principalities in the Tagalog region, the different type of culture prevalent in Luzon gave a less stable and more complex social structure to the pre-colonial Tagalog barangays of Manila, Pampanga and Laguna. Enjoying a more extensive commence than those in Visayan, having the influence of Bonian political contacts, and engaging in farming wet rice for a living, the Tagalogs were described by the Spanish Augustinian friar Martin de Rada as more traders than warriors. The more complex social structure of the Tagalogs was less stable during the arrival of the Spaniards because it was still in a process of differentiating. A Jesuit priest Francisco Colin made an attempt to give an approximate comparison of it with the Visayan social structure in the middle of the 17th century. The term Datu or Lakan, or Apu refers to the chief, but the noble class was the Majanu class. One could be born a Majanu, but could become a Datu by personal achievement. In the Visayan, if the Datu had the personality and economic means, he could retain and restrain competing peers, relatives, and offspring. The term Timuwa came into use in the social structure of the Tagalogs within just 20 years after the coming of the Spaniards. The term, however, was being applied to former Alipin who have escaped bondage by payment, favor, or flight. The Tagalog Timuwas did not have the military prominence of the Visayan Timuwa. The warrior class in the Tagalog society was present only in Laguna, and they were called the Maharlika class. At the early part of the Spanish regime, the number of their members who were coming to rent land from their datus was increasing. Unlike the Visayan datus, the Lakans and Apos of Luzon could call all non-Majanu subjects to work in the Datu Euro unregistered trademark S fields or do all sorts of other personal labor. In the Visayan, only the Oripuns were obliged to do that, and to pay tribute besides. The Tagalog who works in the Datu Euro unregistered trademark S field did not pay him tribute, and could transfer their allegiance to another Datu. The Visayan Timuwa neither paid tribute nor performed agricultural labor. In a sense, they were truly aristocrats. The Tagalog Maharlika did not only work in his Datu Euro unregistered trademark S field, but could also be required to pay his own rent. Thus, all non-Majanu formed a common economic class in some sense, though this class had no designation. In other parts of the archipelago, even though the majority of these barangays were not large settlements, yet they had organized societies dominated by the same type of recognized aristocracy and lordships, as those found in more established, richer and more developed principalities. One should take into consideration that the ideas of principalities, lordship, aristocratic rule, realms, and alliances in the archipelago were not conceived and practiced in the same manner as it was in the West, at the time the people in these islands had their first contact with Europeans. Since the culture of the pre-colonial societies in the Visayan, northern Mindanao, and Luzon were largely influenced by Hindu and Buddhist cultures, the datus who ruled these principalities also share the many customs of royalties and nobles in Southeast Asian territories, especially in the way they used to dress and adorn themselves with gold and silk. The Boxer Codex bears testimony to this fact. the measure of the prince's possession of gold and slaves was proportionate to his greatness and nobility. The first Westerners, who came to the archipelago, observed that there was hardly any Indian who did not possess chains and other articles of gold. Datu during the Spanish period. The Datu class of the four echelons of Filipino society at the time of contact with the Europeans, was referred to by the Spaniards as the Principala. Lorca, and the canon lawyer Antonio de Morga, who classified the society into three estates, also affirmed the usage of this term and also spoke about the preeminence of the principals. All members of this Datu class were principals, whether they ruled or not. San Buenaventura's 1613 Dictionary of the Tagalog language defines three terms that clarify the concept of this Principala. 1. Po cubed n or puna squared principal or head of a lineage. 2. Genu cubed a noble by lineage and parentage, family and descent. 3. Magenu, principal and lineage or parentage. The Spanish term señor is equated with all these three terms, which are distinguished from the Nouveau Riche imitators scornfully called Maginti. Upon the Christianization of most parts of the Philippine archipelago, the datus retained their right to govern their territory under the Spanish Empire. King Philip II of Spain, in a law signed June 11, 1594, commanded the Spanish colonial officials in the archipelago that these native royalties and nobilities be given the same respect and privileges that they had enjoyed before their conversion. Their domains became self-ruled tributary barangays of the Spanish Empire. The Filipino royals and nobles formed part of the exclusive and elite ruling class, called the Principala of the Philippines. The Principala was the class that constituted a birthright aristocracy with claims to respect, obedience, and support from those of subordinate status. With the recognition of the Spanish monarchs came the privilege of being addressed as Don or Do plus or minus A. A mark of esteem and distinction in Europe reserved for a person of noble or royal status during the colonial period. Other honors and high regard were also accorded to the Christianized datus by the Spanish Empire. For example, the gobernadorcillos and Filipino officials of justice received the greatest consideration from the Spanish crown officials. The colonial officials were under obligation to show them the honor corresponding to their respective duties. They were allowed to sit in the houses of the Spanish provincial governors, and in any other places. They were not left to remain standing. It was not permitted for Spanish parish priests to treat these Filipino nobles with less consideration. The gobernadorcillos exercised the command of the towns. They were port captains in coastal towns. Their office corresponds to that of the alcaldes and municipal judges of the Iberian Peninsula. They performed at once the functions of judges and even of notaries with defined powers. They also had the rights and powers to elect assistants and several lieutenants and alguacils, proportionate in number to the inhabitants of the town. By the end of the 16th century, any claim to Filipino royalty, nobility, or hidalgo have disappeared into a homogenized, Hispanized and Christianized nobility, the Principala. This remnant of the pre-colonial royal and noble families continued to rule their traditional domain until the end of the Spanish regime. However, there were cases when succession in leadership was also done through election of new leaders, especially in provinces near the central colonial government in Manila where the ancient ruling families lost their prestige and role. Perhaps proximity to the central power diminished their significance. However, in distant territories, where the central authority had less control and where order could be maintained without using coercive measures, hereditary succession was still enforced until Spain lost the archipelago to the Americans. These distant territories remained patriarchal societies, where people retained great respect for the Principala. The Principala was larger and more influential than the pre-conquest indigenous nobility. It helped create and perpetuate an oligarchic system in the Spanish colony for more than 300 years. The Spanish colonial government's prohibition for foreigners to own land in the Philippines contributed to the evolution of this form of oligarchy. In some provinces of the Philippines, many Spaniards and foreign merchants intermarried with the rich and landed Malayo-Polynesian local nobilities. From these unions, a new cultural group was formed, the mestizo class. Their descendants emerged later to become an influential part of the government, and the Principale. Present-day datus. The present-day claimants of the title and rank of Datu are of three types. The two types are found in Mindanao, and the third type are those that live in the Christianized parts of the Philippines. They are, 1. The datus of the Muslim territories. 2. The datus of the Lumad tribal territories. 3. The descendants of the Principala. The rights of the present-day datus are protected by a special law in the country, known as the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997. Present-day datus of Mindanao. In some indigenous Lumad and Muslim societies in Mindanao, titular datus of ancient royal and noble families still exist. Some of them are active government officials of the Republic of the Philippines, while continuing their cultural and tribal roles as community leaders of their people. Some, although do not have official duties in the Republic, exercise some leadership roles in their tribes. Still others are claimants to these titles. Heirs to the rank of Datu in the Catholic parts of the Philippines. In the Catholic parts of the Philippines, the descendants of the Principala are the rightful claimants of the ancient sovereign royal and noble ranks of the pre-conquest kingdoms, principalities, and barangays of their ancestors. These descendants of the ancient ruling class are now among the landed aristocracy, intellectual elite, merchants, and politicians in the contemporary Filipino society. These people have had ancestors holding the titles of Don, or Doña during the Spanish colonial period, as a compromise by the Spanish crown to their previous indigenous titles. Honorary datus. The title of honorary Datu has also been conferred to certain foreigners and non-tribe members by the heads of local tribes and principalities of ancient origin. During the colonial period, some of these titles carried with them immense legal privileges. For example, on January 22, 1878, Sultan Jamal al-Alam of Sula appointed the Barangay Overbeck as Datu Bendahara and as Raja of Sandakan, with the fullest power of life and death over all the inhabitants. At present, arrangements such as this cannot carry similar legal bearing under the Philippine laws. The various tribes and claimants to the royal titles of certain indigenous peoples in the Philippines have their own particular or personal customs in conferring local honorary titles, which correspond to the specific and traditional social structures of some indigenous peoples in the country. N.B. In unhispanized, unchristianized and unislamized parts of the Philippines, there exist other structures of society, which do not have hierarchical classes. Prohibition of new royal and noble titles in the Philippine Constitution. Article 6, Section 31 of the present Constitution of the Republic of the Philippines, prohibits the granting of new titles of royalty or nobility. Titles of honorary Datu conferred to certain foreigners and non-tribe members by local chieftains are only forms of local award or appreciation for some goods or services done to a local tribe or to the person of the chieftain, and has nothing to do with the creation of legitimate new titles of royalty or nobility. Any contrary claim is otherwise unconstitutional under the Philippine laws. However, an exception is granted by Philippine laws for members of indigenous tribes, in view of the local traditional social structure, through the IPRA law. This special law allows among tribal members, that is, natives, to be conferred with traditional leadership titles as specified under the law's implementing rules and guidelines, which read, A. Right to confer leadership titles. The ICC's IPs concerned, in accordance with their customary laws and practices, shall have the sole right to vest titles of leadership such as, but not limited to, Baas, Datu, Balan, Tamuay, Likid and such other titles to their members. B. Recognition of leadership titles. To forestall undue conferment of leadership titles and misrepresentations, the ICC's IPs concerned, may, at their option, submit a list of their recognized traditional socio-political leaders with their corresponding titles to the NCIP. The NCIP through its field offices, shall conduct a field validation of said list and shall maintain a national directory thereof. C. Issuance of certificates of tribal membership. Only the recognized registered leaders are authorized to issue certificates of tribal membership to their members. Such certificates shall be confirmed by the NCIP based on its census and records and shall have effect only for the purpose for which it was issued. The Fons Honorum in the Philippine Republic is the sovereign Filipino people who are all equal in dignity under a democratic form of government. The Philippine government grants state honors, through the Orders of Merit of the Republic, and through the system of awards and decorations of its military and police forces. These honors accorded by the Orders of Merit do not grant or create titles of royalty or nobility, in accordance to the provisions of the democratic constitution. The Philippines is a rare example of having orders and decorations that are considered of equal rank. This is a reflection of the particular circumstances surrounding the establishment of the various awards, each with its own purpose. There are opinions that ancient Filipino royalties, who never relinquished their sovereign rights by voluntary means, of whom the sovereign powers over their territories passed on to the Spanish jure regalia through some disputed means, retain their Fons Honorum as part of their de jure sovereignty. According to many opinions, as long as the blood is alive in the veins of these royal houses, de jure sovereignty is alive as well which means they can still bestow titles of nobility. However, the practical implications of this claim is unclear. For example, in the case of usurpation of titles by other members of the bloodline. Heads of dynasties belong to one of the three kinds of sovereignty that has been existing in human society. The other two are, heads of states, and traditional heads of the church. The authority that emanates from this last type is transmitted through an authentic apostolic succession, that is, direct lineage of ordination and succession of office from the apostles. These sovereign authorities exercise the following sovereign rights and powers: a oeius imperii a oeius gladii a oeius majestatis and a oeius honum Considering the theory of Jean Bodin, a French jurist and political philosopher, that sovereignty is one and indivisible, it cannot be delegated, sovereignty is irrevocable, sovereignty is perpetual, sovereignty is a supreme power, one can argue about the rights of deposed dynasties, also as Fons Honorum. It can be said that their Fons Honorum depends on their rights as a family, and does not depend on the authority of the de facto government of a state. This is their de jure right. Even though it is not a de facto right, it is still a right. But again, in case of conflict of norms on Fons Honorum in actual situations, the legislations of the de facto sovereign authority have precedence. All others are abrogated, unless otherwise recognized under the terms of such de facto authority. This is the view to reconsider when we study the sovereignty-based political impact of this 1986 law of the Republic of the Philippines, to the long-established Sultanate of Sulu, the Sultanate of Maguindanao and the various Kadatuan communities of the Lumad and Mindanao and Sulu. See also, History of the Philippines, Principala, Confederation of Magyas, Kingdom of Manila, Kingdom of Namayan, Kingdom of Tondo, Kingdom of Butuan, Rajanate of Cebu, Malay styles and titles, Sultanate of Maguindanao, Sultanate of Lanao, Sultanate of Sulu, Confederation of Sultanates in Lanao, recorded list of datus in the Philippines, references. External links, Impact of Spanish colonialization in the Philippines, Encyclopaedia Britannica, Datu, the official website of the Royal Sultanate of Sulu.